Good afternoon. Thank you for the introduction, and nice to see everybody here. I'm going to explore in my presentation a little bit what is happening in the technology development and how it might impact current ships. Basically trying to answer, is there some technology development that might make the current ships obsolete, or at least commercially not so competitive in the next 5, 10, 20 years? So I'm going to divide the technology into roughly two categories. There's the technology to comply with regulations, and then there's the technology to improve performance and reduce cost. And I'll start first with the technology to comply with the regulations. This technology is really seen more as a burden rather than an advancement to the industry. Whether it's ballast water treatment, SOx, exhaust gas cleaning systems, or NOx reducing technologies, there is a significant capital cost and increased operational cost associated with this equipment. Regulatory uncertainty, unproven technology, and equipment that becomes obsolete because of changes in the technology have made industry very cautious about implementing new technology. And early adapters are often disappointed rather than encouraged by the regulatory process. And this, of course, has an impact on implementing other technologies as well, because the industry becomes cautious. So let's look at the regulations. We've been talking about ballast water management for years, and those requirements are now more or less in place. And although there's still some uncertainty, the industry pretty much has a plan how to deal with it, what to install and operate. And so I'm not going to talk about ballast water management. I'm going to focus on the next significant regulatory challenge, which is the IMO global sulfur limit of 0.5%, which takes place from 1 January 2020. So I think we are all familiar with the current compliance options for 2020, which cover distillate fuels, blended fuels, high sulfur fuel with scrubbers, alternative fuels such as LNG, methanol, LPG, ethane. And also now we have low sulfur fuels from residuals and distillate sources. And then there are other options that we may not be quite so familiar with, and because they are not mentioned frequently, and those are gas to liquids, an interesting option, biofuels, biomethanol, biomethane, or hydrogen. So although all these options are very clear, the choice is not at all straightforward. The choice what option to choose really depends on the, first of all, vessel type, operational profile, fuel availability, and really mostly on the assumed cost differential between the fuels. And although we see some increase in interest and orders for the scrubbers or also LNG as a fuel, we can still expect a significant change in the fuel demand profile from 1 January 2020 on. So this figure is it's from Shell, it's trying to illustrate the big step change in 1 January 2020. The figure, the bar figure, shows the blue current demand for heavy fuel oil, which is going to transform to the brown, which is the MDO or low sulfur fuels, with a small amount of heavy fuel oil still on ships that have opted to install scrubbers. And then there's some LNG sprinkled to it. But most of the demand will be fulfilled with the compliant fuels, whether they are distillates or these other low sulfur fuels. There still remain questions on global availability and the quality of these different types of fuels. And even there's a question even on the future availability of heavy fuel oil in bunkering ports around the world. There may be enough volume, but is the fuel oil or the grades of fuel that you want to bunker, are they available to where you want it? So then those who opt to install scrubbers will still have to make a choice on the type of the scrubber that will balance both the capital cost, the operational costs, and the future compliance. The simplest option is, and I'm not going to bore you with a lot of technical detail, I'm just going to go over this very quickly because I've noticed that there is a lot of interest even among the financial people on this. So the simplest option is open loop, which uses seawater scrubbing, but there are concerns about the future changes in discharge water criteria that may reject its use in the future, at least in some areas. The alternative is the closed loop type of scrubber that uses fresh water scrubbing and requires treatment to control the wash water alkalinity. This, of course, creates additional complexities and problems with handling and storing hazardous chemicals. And then we have a hybrid type, which basically allows operation in either mode, but again, adds complexity to the system on board. So again, not a trivial solution, even if you decide to go with a scrubber. Furthermore, we have this international IMO requirement, but then we have regional, local requirements as well that have a different variation on the theme. So I'm going to focus just a little bit on the EU and US. EU has the sulfur directive that does follow the IMO scrubber guidelines, which is good news. However, there is no consistent policy among EU member states for the acceptance of the discharge water within territorial waters of these member states. So they may come up with their own requirements for what's allowable. The US Coast Guard, on the other hand, requires an additional review of the scrubber equivalency approved based on the IMO regulations. So there's another hurdle that needs to be passed. And the US General Permit, VGP, adds additional discharge criteria and additional requirements for monitoring and sampling for those ships that operate in the VGP waters, which is 3 nautical miles from the US coastline. So, putting the installation issues, fuel availability, and regulatory uncertainties aside, the larger the fuel cost differential between compliant fuels and heavy fuel oil, the shorter the payback period for the scrubber. But then there are a number of other factors that influence the decision: company policy, new building versus existing vessels, charter requirements, just to name a few. So, unfortunately, there is no one answer that fits all. So moving now to the second category, which is really technology to improve performance and reduce cost, which is the technology that we often refer as to the technology taking us to the era of smart shipping. So we have seen efforts to reduce fuel consumption and reduce CO2 emissions that have resulted in optimized hull forms and more efficient propulsion systems. And this has really become more or less a standard in ship design. So not much new happening at that front at the moment. So the new technologies that will transition the industry to the next generation of ships will be really driven by electrification of propulsion systems, increased automation, connectivity to shore, and increased computing power and analytics capabilities, which will enable greater use of preventative and predictive maintenance, aids to navigation, and more shore-based support to ships. Oops, sorry, I need to go back. So, although the technology advancement is very fast-paced and offers opportunities, it's not without its challenges. We have challenges still with the reliability of systems, cybersecurity, regulatory hurdles, and gaps in the required skills and cost of the new technology, which are all issues that the industry has to deal with before implementing these new technologies. And therefore, I believe that the focus should be on the interim application of new technology that industry can benefit from on current ships, while understanding and managing the full consequence of the new technology. So if you consider, for example, technology capabilities in situational awareness, object recognition, collision avoidance, these are all technologies that are being developed as part of the autonomous ship development. But you don't need to have an autonomous ship to apply some of these technologies. They can become aids to navigation, which can increase the safety of shipping. Propulsion systems that rely on predictive or preventative maintenance routines could improve operational efficiency. Electric propulsion is an interesting one, and it offers an alternative in the future for diesel propulsion. And there are hybrid solutions that are more imminently available, but to really apply this for deep sea shipping, considerable amount of further development is needed in the battery technology. Another interesting one is additive manufacturing, often called as 3D printing, which really can offer opportunities in the future for better inventory management for spares. And if this gets combined with the improved robustness and reliability of systems, as well as predictive and preventative maintenance, this can really offer a step change in how ships are operated without changing the ships themselves. So the reliance on automation, data, and connectivity will also require very robust cyber security to be incorporated from design to operations. And it will change how the crews interact with the systems, and of course the training that will be required for competence. Successful implementation will require regulatory changes together with robust product development and service support. And safety, of course, will remain a very important requirement for governments, for classification societies, industry, and insurance. All the changes must be carried out so that shipping will be at least as safe and environmentally friendly as it is today. So this new technology will change ships and shipping, but the question remains, how fast will this be implemented, and what will be the impact on today's ships? So circling back to the discussion on technology to comply with regulations, the industry is likely to be cautious of testing new alternative technologies without a proof of functionality. The regulatory process will take time, and also we need to keep in mind that the technologies that I've been talking about, these will be technologies that can be retrofitted on existing ships if we can demonstrate cost benefit. So moving forward, we must expect the unexpected. Technology is moving so fast. But one of the things we know for sure is that the environmental regulations will stay and will have an impact on our ships and our operations. As far as the other type of digital technology, It's exciting. I think it will benefit even current ships, but the step change for the ship itself is likely to have a longer horizon. And there are more likely to be changes introduced to the commercial process in shipping supply chains than the ships itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tikka. I think we might have a couple of questions here because you were talking about some fairly groundbreaking initiatives there. Do I have a question from the audience? A gentleman here. I know that most people know you, but please could you just state your name and company just for a few visitors we may have here from foreign parts.
Good afternoon. I'm George Savliris. A question which is rather, I don't want to put the spanners in the works, but as usual we've heard the same scenario about the scrubbers, which is, I know you've mentioned other issues in your topic, but I think the scrubbers is most revolutionary issue right now because it could cause a multi-billion-dollar cost to the industry, and in my personal view, unnecessarily. Now, if you hear the likes of some people who are much more conversant with technology than I am, the whole issue which has been mentioned about low sulfur fuel not being able to be made in time, I think it's a fallacy. If it's not a fallacy, again, there has to be a situation of where you have to confront having, for example, an $11–12 million ship of, say, 10–12 years old. To fit a scrubber, you're talking about a capital cost of $1.6–1.7 million. That ship, once she puts a scrubber, if she is in a situation of having to fit a scrubber, in 2 or 3 years' time, she starts smelling of scrap. Because when a ship approaches 15 years old, she may not be scrap, but she starts smelling of scrap. The other issue which they haven't addressed in the market is that the fact that the scrubbers, you may resolve the issue of sulfur in the environment, but are we also aware of the fact that the way scrubbers work, and again, I'm not technically minded, I've just got very limited knowledge on this field, but what about the sulfur which subsequently is put into the sea? Because by evading the sulfur from the air, the sulfur goes into the sea. So effectively now we've got the environmentalists who are concerned about the air pollution, and a few years down the road will be concerned about all the sulfur you're throwing in the water. Any comments? Thank you.
Thank you. I think all very valid points. And these are issues that I think the industry is struggling with. We do not see a lot of retrofitting of scrubbers. There are certain types of vessels that seem to opt more for scrubbers than others, even for existing vessels. For example, passenger vessels and cruise ships seem to opt more in percentage-wise. We do see scrubber installations or scrubber-ready designs more on new buildings, and especially on the larger new buildings, because of the space requirements. Now, the discharge water issue is a big one, and that's what makes the difference in deciding whether to install open loop, closed loop, or hybrid. And as I mentioned, in the EU, for example, there is no common policy between the member states. So there is an uncertainty whether the member states will allow discharge water from open loop in the future. So I think these are very valid points, and like I said, scrubber is not, it's not a trivial solution, and some companies have company policies, no scrubbers. Then there are others who have more like a hybrid approach, depending on the type of the vessel. So again, it's almost like a transition solution for those who opt to put it on their new buildings, because the reasoning may be that there's going to be a sufficient cost differential in the beginning, which will make the payback period very short in 2020. And then there's a next decision point in a year or two whether they'll continue using the scrubber or not. So that's how I see it. It's a very complex issue. George.
Thank you very much. Is there another question from the gentleman here?
George Gratsus. You spoke about fuels. I wasn't in the room when you did, but I understand that you did. Scrubbers, if what I read is correct, will probably have today about 500 ships with them and probably about 800 ships by 2020 or thereabouts. The ocean-going fleet of cargo ships is roughly 60, 70,000 ships or something like that.
Yep.
So that is a minuscule quantity. On the assumption that we won't have enough stable fuel, low sulfur fuel, obviously world trade will stop, but because world trade will not stop, something will have to happen. Now, if we're going to have low sulfur fuel, it must be stable. Right now, the only way you can do it is with mixing, unless they have managed, refineries have managed to desulfurize heavy fuel mix. So if you mix heavy fuel with gas oil, the molecules are totally different. They will stratify differently in the tanks. You don't have a mixer inside each tank, so you can't keep the emulsion or whatever it is uniform. And I have heard of stories that right now there are companies that know better that have used that, that have used mixed oil, that have difficulty in taking the residue out of the tanks. So there's a heap of problems if the industry doesn't have enough low sulfur fuel oil that is stable and within the IMO specifications with regard to flash point and all that kind of stuff. Your comments, please.
George, I don't think I can add a whole lot to your comments. I think, again, they are very valid comments. They are something that were discussed in PPR, IMO PPR, the pollution prevention and recovery session last week. I don't have solutions, unfortunately. Those are all issues that we need to deal with before 2020.
I hope trade doesn't stop.
I don't think that's going to happen. Some people may make a lot of money during that period, carrying fuels around the world.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Tikka, for answering those questions. Please put your hands together once again for our guest speaker.